We've been going through the Hebrews theme here to get us through chapter 8 because of the mention of the the mention of the true tent. And so these are the three primary words he uses a lot to get across this idea of shifting from a finished form that is better than what was before. We've been talking about this true tent and how this true tent can be interpreted. It's pretty clear that the writer of the book of Hebrews is talking in a more concrete way than sometimes we approach it, thinking of it in a more spiritual light. And the book of Revelation follows that pattern. I offered three different explanations for this, the first two being pretty common to this interpretation in Hebrews. The approach of the book of Hebrews and the perfect form is that Moses saw a pattern, what is basically a blueprint of what he should build, that God showed him. And we're going to talk more in depth about how exactly that's approached in Hebrews. Or he saw the literal temple that was already in heaven that is being spoken of in the book of Hebrews. And then the third option being that it was simply meant as a teaching aid. Before we move on today, I want to kind of dig into that idea just a tad to make preparation for what we're talking about here. A teaching aid, another way of saying a teaching aid, is an allegory. And we've already talked about an allegory previously when we talked about Plato's cave allegory. So, what is an allegory? An allegory is using something concrete, using something real to convey an idea that is only an idea. We have an example of that in the New Testament. This word is actually used in the New Testament in Galatians. So here's an example of what a biblical allegory looks like. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman, one by a free woman. The son of the slave woman was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now, paying attention to what we're seeing here, this is not talking about something like a parable. It's not a made-up story. This is something that actually happened. Abraham had a child by Hagar. Abraham had a child by Sarah. So it's a real thing that happened. But, as we see in verse 24, this may be interpreted allegorically, as an allegory, that God had this all really happen, but he had it happen to convey another idea, an idea separate from simply the birth of two children. This may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem. So the temple worship in Jerusalem, in essence, the law being interpreted through the sacrifices in Jerusalem. For she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. So this is an example of exactly the kind of allegory that we're talking about here. It's introduced in the New Testament that some things God has done have only been allegorical, that they were meant to convey an idea that was completely separate from the concrete reality that we live in. And like I said, we've already discussed an allegory, Plato's cave allegory. When Plato made this up to explain something, he wasn't saying that we literally live in a cave and see shadows, but it explains something concrete, explaining something that we can't really see. Same idea. The question that we're answering in the immediate place that we're in chapter 8 of Hebrews is this just an allegory? is the tabernacle that God showed Moses a pattern of and Moses made, and then the temples that came after it that were built. Was that just an allegory? Or is there really a heavenly temple somewhere that Jesus walked into and offered his sacrifice? That's the question here. That's what we're talking about. So let's make one more trip through this. We talked about how Paul in 2 Corinthians talked about our bodies being jars of clay that we live in now, but that we don't lose heart because that's not the real thing. From his perspective here, he says, the things that are seen, our bodies, are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So there's some sort of unseen within us that is eternal, which is different from the jars of clay that we live in. They're not eternal. Jesus here, when he's talking to the woman at the well, talks about God being just a spirit. And so, since God is a spirit, the physical forms that we see talked about with God, having hands and feet and those sorts of things, are allegorical. He doesn't really have hands. He doesn't really have fingers and toes. It's an allegory. So we have that. We also have Paul saying that there is a resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. So there's actually a physical resurrection of some sort that he talks about. He also says in Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body. So our bodies will be transformed into other bodies. So that doesn't sound allegorical. That sounds real and concrete. And just to pile on to that idea, we're going to be transformed to be like Jesus' glorious body. And Jesus said to the disciples, see my hands and feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. So we've got different ideas going on here. And there are things that are allegorical, and there is a spiritual side to things, but we also have these concrete examples where when it talks about resurrection, it's talking about a physical body that has flesh and bones. There's this phrase in the New Testament, not made with hands. It gets used across the spectrum. It's in Acts. Paul uses it a few times. And we're going to see that it's in the book of Hebrews. We haven't gotten there yet, but we're going to. So what's this idea of not made with hands? In a couple times in Acts. Howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands. God made the world and all things therein, and dwelleth not in temples made with hands. But what does that sound like it's saying? If he doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, he does what? Dwell in temples. He dwells in a temple. So the writer of Acts, Luke, seems to be implying to us that there is a temple that God lives in heaven. It's not clear though. Maybe not. He may not have meant that, but that's what we're hearing from here. Paul says, for we know that if our earthly house of tabernacle, speaking of this, our flesh, were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Sounds like we have a place to go to that is real, that it's a building of God. That word building means what we call building. And it's just not made with hands, but it is literally in heaven. He's speaking of a body, obviously, because he says our eternal house of tabernacle. He's talking about our bodies. We have a physical body in heaven. In Colossians, Paul says, in whom also you are circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, and putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. So here he's talking about circumcision being without hands. The circumcision of God on us is without hands, but that's not a physical circumcision. You don't see that happen. So he's talking about circumcision here in a spiritual sense. So we have him going both ways between Corinthians and Colossians. So again, some of it is allegorical, some of it is actual in the way that it's talked about. Here we have a couple of examples from the Gospels where Jesus is talking about the temple. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. Now, important thing to note here is that it's not saying Jesus said this. It says that Jesus' accuser says he says this. This is during his trial. So the accuser says, I heard him say he would destroy this temple made with hands and build another made without hands. And then from what we see in the other Gospels and in Mark, when Jesus actually says it, this is kind of what he says, which is said here in John 2. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So that's what Jesus said. When this temple is destroyed, I will raise it up in 3 days. Which way did Jesus mean that? Well, if you follow it to verse 21, he was speaking about the temple of his body. So it was what? When he said, if you destroy this temple, I will raise it up in 3 days, how did he mean it? Allegorically. This kind of leaves us in a large and vast gray area, because this means that Genesis 1:1 all the way through Revelation, anything in between could simply be allegory. And that makes literal interpretations difficult. And Augustine was big on taking things that we didn't like, literally, and turning them into allegories, because it simplifies things. It makes it less complicated, less hard to explain. The problem is we don't know what is allegory and what is literal. Book of Hebrews uses this phrase, and we're going to see it in chapter 9. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. And then in verse 24, for Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. That kind of leaves us in the same place. The writer of the book of Hebrews seems to be describing something literal and concrete, but maybe not. We don't know. It's there's not any direct explanation of how it's meant. And this is what we're left with throughout the New Testament. Could be allegory, could be real. We have the perfect form, meaning what Moses saw was just a blueprint of what God wanted on earth. And he took that blueprint and made it what he could make, and then we continue to make temples out of it. And then, when Christ comes to offer a sacrifice, literally, there is a temple a tabernacle in heaven that he goes into the Holy of Holies and offers a literal sacrifice of his own blood, of himself. That's what's implied in this perfect form. And this is the most obvious idea that the writer of the book of Hebrews is using. He means it this way. But we tend to think of it in terms of this column. This is the way we generally think about it. That there has always been a temple in heaven, an eternal temple, and that Moses was shown that eternal temple, and he made the best copy he could of it. And so when Jesus needed a temple to offer a sacrifice in, this one had always been there, and the Holy of Holies was just sitting there empty and idle until Jesus makes his sacrifice. And it's the one and only sacrifice ever made in this temple. So that's the idea that we tend to think of, because we tend to think of these things in a more spiritual sense. And then there's the whole idea that this may all just be an allegory, that there's not really a temple in heaven, because God is a spirit. He doesn't need a building to live in. And so this temple is simply Moses seeing a vision, and Hebrews is all allegory when it talks about a temple. And the one that John saw in the book of Revelation, again, was just a vision of heaven. Now, there are interpretations, just to take this one step further. The Ark of the Covenant is seen in the temple in heaven in the book of Revelation. It says literally, John saw the Ark of the Covenant in the temple in heaven. There are interpretations where the Ark of the Covenant was actually physically removed from earth by God, and the one in heaven is the ark that Moses built. Just to throw that out there. So you have this wide range of interpretation and understanding. Pick one. Or make one of your own out of the three, because there aren't any clear answers to these questions. But this is where we find ourselves with this whole issue. But again, the writer of the book of Hebrews seems to be doing this. That Moses saw a blueprint, and God then provided one at the time of Jesus' sacrifice for him to really offer a sacrifice in. So, where does that put us? We've talked about this whole idea. This is what the writer of the book of Hebrews is doing. He's shifting everything to a better form than what was before, that is finished, completed. We've talked about these four things that we've already addressed. We've actually addressed one other, but I left that one off so we can come back to it at the end of this chapter. Now, the point in what we are saying is this, and this is in essence the reason we've had to talk about these things, because he's making his point. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up and not man. Is the writer of the book of Hebrews, when he says this, does he literally mean there is a place, a seat that Jesus is sitting in heaven beside of God? That's what it sounds like he's saying. So he's not being allegorical when he says this. People can transform it into an allegory, but that's not what he intended. He proceeds, for every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest, Jesus, also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. And he was not qualified to do that, being from Judah. They serve a copy and a shadow of heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So all those things he's described, all the promises that are now ours, and the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, all of that is better, and Christ is fulfilling all of that betterness. He's obtained a better, more excellent ministry. And it sounds like all of this is meant not allegorically, but literally. He continues on through this idea. For if that first covenant, the law that we're used to with the sacrifices, if it had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second one. And remember, he started this chapter again, pointing back to Psalm 110, where it says that there's a waiting period for another priest to come along after the order of Melchizedek with something better. That's what he's talking about. And if that first covenant, the law, had been faultless, there would have been no reason to prophesy something better in Psalms. For he finds fault with them when he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Here we have a long quotation from Jeremiah 31, which starts out with God telling them, the days are coming when I will establish a new covenant beyond the covenant you have now. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, speaking of the coming of Christ, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Keeping in mind that this is a quotation from the book of Jeremiah. This is in the Old Testament. So God has spoken already in the Old Testament that he's changing the covenant. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. Now, we got to focus in here, because we would tend to think of this change in covenant as happening with the coming of Christ. Because now, with the arrival of the Holy Spirit in us when we reach salvation, that's how we think of it. We no longer have outside laws we follow. We have laws that have been put into our minds and our hearts that we follow through the Holy Spirit. But note what he says here. There's no need to teach anyone about it, because everybody already has it. So he's not talking about now. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to have church. So he's talking about a point in the future in Jeremiah with this prophecy. Because at that point, everybody has these laws in their minds and hearts. I will be merciful toward their iniquities. I will remember their sins no more. All of that was from Jeremiah 31. So he wraps up the chapter this way. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. The important thing in this verse is the verb tenses that he's using here, the time direction that he's using here. What did Jesus say about the law? Did Jesus say, I've come to eradicate the law and to make it obsolete and make it go away? That's not what he said. So is the writer of the book of Hebrews contradicting what Jesus said? Well, notice that he doesn't say the law is eradicated. What he says here is he's speaking of a new covenant, talking about what's in Jeremiah. God was speaking of a new covenant. When he does that, he makes the first one obsolete. But here's the key. What is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. We like black and white. We like clear beginning and a clear ending. And the idea of dispensationalism, which was adopted by the evangelical church 150 years ago, kind of works that way. God worked with Adam and Eve this way. God worked with Noah this way. God worked with the children of Israel this way. So you have these clear-cut differences, different covenants for each one of those. This implies that that's not how it works. That there's a lot of bleed over, back and forth, because the covenant that we're moving toward replaces the covenant of the Old Testament at the time of Jeremiah. But it doesn't cut it off and introduce it with the coming of Christ. Here he's saying it is becoming obsolete and it's growing old and at some point will be ready to disappear. So there's this crossover that we see here. So we're not used to dealing with it in those terms necessarily. That's not the way we like to do it. We prefer to have a more rigid format, but God doesn't necessarily work with us in a rigid format. So there are two more things to add to this list. Jesus going to heaven was an improvement, a betterment. The promise that we have is better than the one given to Abraham and Israel. The priesthood of Melchizedek is better than the priesthood of the law. And when he was talking about them moving from before salvation to after salvation, how that was a movement to the better. So now we're talking about the old covenant becoming a new covenant, but it's coming. It's not replaced at this point, but it's happening, is how he describes it. The one thing that we've already talked about that I didn't add to this list before, but was because it's a bit of a distraction in our minds, because it's one of those things that we don't think about that way. We don't like to think about it that way. But it's still what the writer of the book of Hebrews says. We have an unperfected Jesus becoming a better Jesus. That's what he says happens. He said that Jesus was incomplete and became perfect through suffering when he came. Your gut reaction there is, oh, that sounds terrible. That can't be true. But that's literally what he says. So this is the other better that he talks about here. Jesus is better after his suffering than he was before. This is where you have to get into the idea of allegory, because this could be taken in an allegorical way, that Jesus' mission was not accomplished until he had suffered. Not that he was actually different from one point to the next, but that he had to go through this to complete the mission. What he says in the book of Hebrews, you can take it however you want to, but he's already said this 3 times, that Jesus was perfected, made better through his suffering. So I'm not just making that up and throwing it at you. That's what he says. So it's there, you have to deal with it. So now we can move to chapter 9, chapter 10, where he basically wraps up everything that he wants to talk about with these things. The part of the book from 11 to the end is admonitions, things to help you, to exhort you, to strengthen you. So his whole point will be wrapped up in these next 2 chapters, which we'll go to next. So we'll pick it up there next week.